The Motion of the Stars by Carabas. Read by My Name is R. Part 1. In their course are the celestial bodies, kept by our blood royal. In secret they hold their art, though rumor upon rumor places a ceremony at each coronation or the deathbed of a monarch. The possible passing of a flame from each reigning prince and princess of unicorn kind. Such glories do our sovereigns wield, for by their wisdom are the sun and moon and unnumbered stars kept in their proper paths, and thus in their hooves rests ultimate supremacy over the world entire. Generously are these same blessings given unto the lesser pony tribes and other races. The book rambled on, blue light from the tip of Rarity's horn breathing life into the yellowed pages. Her gaze narrowed, searching for any hint, any clue, anything beyond secret. The strain of holding the magic tingled painfully down Rarity's horn, and she released it with a wince. The darkness of the surrounding dusk washed back in, turning the world around her to a morass of silhouettes and half-glimpsed forms once more. Her weary eyes welcomed the respite, and she rubbed at them with her one good forehoof. Red on her left side, blackness on her right, each opposite horizon brushed by the still sun and moon. Above and between, an expanse of deepest indigo dusted with the faintest stars, and marred by wandering clouds. Before her, what had once been the Whitetail Woods. Incentive of a sort. She sat on a ridge, the grass beneath her damp with recent rainfall. Rarity shifted so that her weight came down on her good side, coaxed a dim blue light back into existence, and resumed reading. After a few more minutes, when it stopped talking about celestial mechanics altogether and started wittering on about the then-recent coronation of Princess Platinum, Rarity closed the book and flicked it to one side. It tumbled down the grassy slope she lay on, joining a pile of several others. Useless, each and every one. The ridge was a cold and exposed place to do her work. The journey through the tangled forest to get here was a hard one, and Rarity was already tired. But she rose, as she always did, and looked up into the sky. Her light fell away, but the flickering aura around her horn persisted, tottering slightly as her withered, crystal-blistered left side threatened to fall. Rarity closed her eyes, breathed, and sounded up into the dusk. There, as always, on the edge of her magical perception, the sun and moon, vast and unmistakable, whirlpools of utter, entrancing magic amidst the vast arcane sea, suspended in motion, still, dead. Rarity reached further, straining herself with the force of the rising grasp, her gaze and attention up, her grasping magic groping upwards, onwards, onwards. A painful stretch, her limits reached and tensed and creaking with effort. And with the last of her strength, she felt her magical grasp glide briefly across the edge of what might have been the outermost extent of the moon, the shortest of touches, and then freefall in the dark as Rarity collapsed, landing on her crippled side, and gasping with the pain of that and her aching horn both. Her vision swam back into focus, light and lines bleeding back into the fogged darkness. She tried to conjure light to let her see clearly, but the effort made her almost black out with the pain from her horn, and she fell back. The moon and sun shone at the edges of the twilight expanse, fixed and unmoving, as they always did, as they always would. Useless, useless, useless. Eventually, after what felt like hours, Rarity awkwardly rose to her hooves and coaxed a little light forth. She trudged towards the discarded books, intent on collecting them into her worn saddlebags. It would be a hard walk back. "Rarity?" The voice rang out at her back, clear and sweet as any bell, and Rarity turned to her younger sister, Sweetie Belle. The young mare cantered towards Rarity on long, powerful legs, a grateful genetic inheritance from their father. Worn saddlebags obscured the curving cleft that was her cutie mark. Her mane tumbled around her head in rose and mulberry curls, and Rarity couldn't help but imagine the contrast with her own prematurely grey-streaked mane. Bright green eyes regarded Rarity with concern, and the long wooden staff Sweetie held at her side in a magical grasp fell into a resting position. "Good timing, Sweetie," said Rarity, smiling in spite of her fatigue. "I was about to take these books home, and my magic's feeling a little strained. If you could be a dear and help me get them into my bags—" "Soul's sake, Rarity! You shouldn't keep coming out here by yourself. It isn't safe. At least let me come with you." Sweetie rushed up to Rarity's side. A thread of green magic lifted Rarity's saddlebags into the air and started gathering the books off the ground and into it. "You're busy most of the time, Sweetie, working hard to keep us going. This is a daft old mare's hobby, and I shouldn't—" "Daft? No arguing there. Suppose a timber wolf found you, or any hungry predator, or the less friendly sort of wanderer. If I'm away and I can't come to help, what happens then, Rarity?" "Thank you for being concerned, Sweetie, but it'd be no great loss if—" Sweetie Belle snorted bitterly and slung Rarity's saddlebags onto the end of her stick, releasing her magic and couching it under one leg like a bindle. "Don't." Rarity fell quiet. Sweetie Belle trotted at her side, still supporting her, and together they began the long walk back down through the tangled forest and rough-ridged valley to where they called home, or at least shelter. At their back, Rarity knew the slope would descend into what had once been the Whitetail Woods, but no trees grew there now, no green or growing things beyond a few paltry saplings struggling up through the blackened, cracked earth into the meager light. One place, amongst so many in Equestria, where armies had once marched, where the Equestrian legions and the Grand Alliance had fought and screamed and butchered one another amidst the forest with mad desperation of fighting dogs. One place amongst many which had been bathed in light when all the stars seemed to rise at once. When they rose and came falling back to the earth to send tides of fire screaming across the world, across Equestria, and maybe beyond. Who knew? Who was left to know? Rarity nuzzled Sweetie's neck as they gently withdrew into the shadowed forest. "I'm sorry, darling. Ignore what I say." Sweetie Belle was silent for a moment, and then returned to the nuzzle. Her smile was weak, forced. Her eyes, Rarity saw, were red-rimmed with her own tiredness. "Sure. Why break a good habit?" Green light flourished from her horn and cut through the murk before them. The rough path ran on, and they followed its course. Rarity let Sweetie Belle guide their descent. There was nothing else she could do now. Cold woke Sweetie, as it did often these days. No warming sunlight meant that the dying of the fire was her timepiece. She shrugged off thin blankets and gradually rose to her hooves, shaking her head to try and drive out fatigue's cobwebs. A brief questing with her magic alighted upon the wood-heaped scuttle. Several pieces were laid gently into the dead embers, and Sweetie Belle ignited them. Light spilled across the dinginess of their shelter, hit Sweetie Belle with a warm, welcome blast of air, and illuminated Rarity's sleeping form. Rarity lay still on her right side, leaving her ravaged left to absorb the fire's heat. Her legs were withered, her ribs pressed hard against her seared and hairless hide. Little crystalline growths sprouted along her legs and flanks, red and sore around the edges, and glistening orange in the firelight. Her eyes remained closed, and her chest rose and fell gently, so gently that it could have been mistaken for stillness. A haphazard pile of books sat by her head, and one by her hoof. She'd contrived to twist free of her own blanket in her sleep. Sweetie Belle gathered it up and covered her anew, taking care to tuck her in. Satisfied, she left her sister sleeping and gathered up her staff. There was work to be done. She'd wriggled out through the narrow opening of their home, taking care not to scratch herself on the splintered planks, and entered the twilight woods. First, as always, she took a moment to get her bearings and take in the world. The full scale of the secluded valley spread out before her, and no abnormal or dangerous noises came from it. No scuffles, no tramp of distant hooves from lone wanderers, no keens or screams or sign of anything on the move, just the murmur of the wind through branches. Sweetie Belle breathed easily, summoning a small amount of light, and trotted down into the forest. The trees rose tall and pale around her, bark flaking from their branches and trunks, their few leaves rustling. Scarcely enough light for the poor things. Fruit was hard to come by these days, no matter how far she dared wander. Less so for mushrooms, though. She brightened when her gaze caught a cluster of them half hidden in a rooty crevice, checked that they were edible, neatly plucked them from the ground, and fed them into her saddlebag. Throughout, she recalled where the valley's berry bushes were, and which she'd taken from recently. They'd fared a little better than the trees, though their growing seasons were similarly haywire and rare. Sweetie Belle continued to crisscross the valley, sticking to the routes she knew, stepping over roots and crunching mulch and thin grass underhoof. A song built up inside her, and she went along, and she gave it release, crooning snatches that seemed to fill the forest's emptiness. Maybe a bird or two would hear it. Some still flew overhead from time to time, making for the west and the sun. Time slipped by, as best she could gauge it, and eventually she decided to return home. Her saddlebags bulged slightly with the mushrooms, berries, and low-hanging nuts and acorns she'd dislodged with her stick. Not much, but enough to keep her from regarding their food stores with too much dismay. Only one job, and more yet to come. Collecting water, watching the high passes for any beasts or ponies that might be on the road, maybe taking down one of the ailing trees for fresh lumber. But those could wait. Rarity and the day's meal beckoned. She trudged back up through the forest, returning to their ramshackle wooden hut. Thin trails of smoke, all but invisible against the dark sky, trickled up through the heathered roof. Rarity must have risen and kept the fire going. Sweetie Belle slipped in through the warm opening and saw Rarity sitting with a book suspended before her snout. The older unicorn looked up as she entered and lowered the book, revealing a frayed smile. "Good day, sweetie." "Hey, feeling better?" "Considerably. Thank you for asking." Sweetie Belle made for the back of their home, past Rarity, their beds, and the fire. In the cramped space, boxes and rusty scuttles and small crates were stacked. Gathered food and old tins, rope and sawn wood, nails and fabric and spare blankets, anything she'd scavenged that might be useful. And in one crate, the largest one, and one closest to Rarity, books. Sweetie checked a few of the titles on top as she passed by, titles she recognized from Rarity's reading last night. Lives and Times of the Magos Princeps, Theories on Celestial Mechanics and the Motion of the Stars, Sun and Moon, Love and Magic, the Princesses and their Domains. Their supplies shared space with little decorations and knickknacks, some made and some scavenged. A little silver figure of Luna, resplendent in flight. Little sewn wall hangings, splashes of color in the murk. And at the back, half covered by boxes and covering the gaps in one wall, A small and lovingly made tapestry of old friends. Sweetie Belle never looked at it for long. At least it had kept Rarity happy while she'd been making it. She distributed what she'd gathered between the appropriate containers, keeping some aside and drawing out a stand and an old kettle, half full with water. "I'll make a mash, enough for today and tomorrow. Sound good?" Boiled and mashed mushrooms, berries, and nuts was something of an acquired taste, judging by Rarity's protests when the dish had first been conceived of. But Sweetie Belle didn't mind. At least conscious intent was usually required when cooking it in order for burnt carbon to emerge. "Sounds lovely," said Rarity, with only the smallest of winces. "Just a little bit for me." "No proper figure was ever gotten by grazing alone," Sweetie Belle recited, as she emptied the ingredients into the kettle and suspended it in the stand above the fire. She twirled her staff and started methodically pulping the mixture with the clean end of it. "A lady must enjoy a full and balanced diet if she is to maintain her healthy and appealing build. It is considered unseemly in polite society to turn one's elder sister's wise words upon them, sweetie darling. Neither should one turn up their snouts at fare generously cooked and offered, for to snub it is to dismiss the spirit in which it was given. I listened to some of the things you said, you know." "To my abiding regret, indeed you did." Rarity sighed and put the book back into the crate with its companions. "Scarcely useful, that one," she muttered to herself. Sweetie Belle chose not to respond. "Give it a few minutes, and then we'll eat," she said, as the liquid in the kettle began to simmer. She tapped her staff across the brim to dislodge a few clinging drops, and stepped back to regard it with appreciation. "I put the bowls somewhere. Do you remember? I want to make another trip to Canterlot." Silence descended as Sweetie Belle bit her tongue. She turned back to the mash and stirred it with her staff, gaze fixed upon it. "I've worked through the last haul. None of them helped. Told me nothing I didn't already know, or what they clearly didn't know. But there were other libraries, other archives. One of them will surely have something. The palace's own shelves. There was surely something there I missed." Sweetie Belle tapped the staff against the kettle's brim, with more force than she intended. "Remember the last trip, Rarity? It was hard enough afterwards that you nearly—" She scowled and resumed stirring up furious whirls of the liquid. "Not again. Not until you're properly rested. Not unless you're sure there's nothing in what you've already got." "I am sure, sweetie, on both of those counts. I'm quite myself again." Her voice softened. "And you know I wouldn't ask this unless I was sure it was necessary." Sweetie Belle watched the mash thicken as the liquid steamed off. She unhooked the kettle from the stand and set it on the ground. "I could go by myself. Make you promise to stay in here and just use the food and wood we've got stored. Hide the entrance with a screen of rubble and branches. I could go to Canterlot and check the libraries for what you might need. I wouldn't want to leave you by yourself for so long unless I had that first promise, though." She regarded Rarity as she found and drew out their 2 bowls. Rarity returned the look only briefly before turning her gaze to one side. "I'm sorry, but—" "Of course you are." Sweetie Belle poured measures of the mash into each bowl, short and sharp dips of the kettle that left a few stray splatters on the floor. She pushed one bowl in front of Rarity and sat down heavily next to her own. One more moment of silence, a moment that could have been mistaken for Sweetie Belle coming to a decision. But she'd known what she'd decide from the moment Rarity had made the request, as she always did. Dragging one hoof down her face, she resignedly muttered, "I'll need time to get our things together." "No rush," said Rarity quietly. "No rush at all." Meal and a prolonged packing later, they were ready. Rarity's saddlebag was light upon her back, due in part to the nature of the journey, only enough food to get to Canterlot and back, with room for things to be added. And partly, she suspected, because Sweetie Belle had shifted most of it to her own bags. She wanted to protest. She should have done so, insisted on carrying at least her share. But her body would rebel, sooner or later, as it had done before. Generosity is a luxury indulged in by the strong, dear, and you're hardly what you once were, are you? Vile thought. Rarity pushed it from mind as she ventured with Sweetie Belle to the eastern ridge of the valley, the last shelter before the world's end. She was already breathing heavily before they cleared the tangle of boulders and tall bushes that curtained off what had once been Equestria. Partly from exertion, and partly from the tension that coiled tight around her gut whenever this view threatened. The same wound rubbed out from the same scar, time and time again. Sweetie Belle regarded her. "Are you sure you're all right?" "Yes, sweetie, I am," she lied. Gathering herself, Rarity fell in behind Sweetie Belle as she bludgeoned a path through the last barrier of foliage. They broke out into the open, over the rolling landscape far below, over Equestria under dusk. Great grey ribbons had been flayed across the rising and falling hills around, blazing wide and curved lines across the bellies of fields and ravines, through forests and buildings, the impact of the Grand Alliance's great spells falling from the sky to wreak destruction and leave ash and bitter salt in their wake, the last act of a savage war, a spiteful parting shot after the armies had been worn down, after the armies had already wrought far too much. Past a rise of small hills, on the border of the scarred Everfree, there rested the ruins of buildings, skeletal, ash-dusted frames clutching like claws up at the sky. On the edge, a farmhouse's outline sat at rest. Elsewhere, a grey and shattered boutique. Roads and rises, and the scorched remains of meadows where she'd once walked. She could still imagine them now, feel the memory of a summer sun's warmth across her back, feel dew under her hooves, hear the voices of ponies raised in chatter, song, bickering, love. Feel the heat, hear the drums, see the fire. Rarity's breath hung solid in her throat. How long had it been since that day? 15, or however many years ago? Since the Great War, that distressing but nebulous entity of frantic newspaper headlines, rationing, troop drafts, and crippled homecoming soldiers, came to Ponyville. She could close her eyes and still hear the cries and barked commands from the tight formation on Main Street, unicorns and earth ponies standing wither to wither behind hasty barricades, a cordon of Pegasi in the air above them, calling out observation after dreadful observation. "Crow out flyers! At least 100! A Capric force at the center, coming from the south!" Rarity had been in the fleeing refugee column. Where else could she have been? What could she have offered to the formation behind her? The mix of townsponies and equestrian guard, standing lonely against the oncoming pipes and drums. They'd moved slowly, and she'd looked back all the while, saw her friends, saw the onslaught, saw the world painted red with blasts and spellfire, the sky blackening and the buildings burning, the bodies strewn hither and thither, lying like broken dolls, twitching, screaming. A day after, a day too late, she'd stepped through the ruins, circuited the outskirts. She'd called out time and again, desperation mounting for any pony, to answer her. She'd found Applejack and the apples, dead in their home, dead where they'd made their stand. Black feathers and broken horns and so much blood, hewn nearly unrecognizable, and a distance from them, in Fluttershy's home, the Pegasus herself with her slain animals. A single arrow, and the deed had been done. To go fighting, or go quickly? One consideration amongst countless others that had drummed in the back of Rarity's mind after that black time, when she'd had no time for anything but remembering and considering. Was one preferable? Was it a fool's game to even try to rank the choices? Either one was surely at least preferable to the ibex she'd found and kept well away from. A female officer in battered barding and a wound around her neck, staggering, blinded by the spellfire through the town center, croaking feebly for help. Her friends, water, another voice, anything. Sometimes Rarity still dreamed of that, and if she was lucky in the dreams, she reached out, or at least spoke before turning her back. Rarity? But never mind that. She had work to do, here and now. She steadied herself, forced the memories from her mind, and followed Sweetie Belle down from their high point and into the grey wastes. The thin grass underhoof was replaced by clammy silt, and then by cracked and blackened earth covered with the finest layer of ash. The odd green sapling, the occasional striving blade of grass, and a little more. Fire here. It had been ice that had fallen elsewhere. Razor-edged wind, choking darkness, a storm of crystals. There had been so many particular dooms. They said, those few who'd gathered together and fled to Canterlot in the wake of the first great spells back in the day, that the capricious crown had called upon dark magic, had ordered mass blood sacrifice from his own Capric subjects and Corvid allies to empower the great spells, bleeding Capra and Corva dry to get equal satisfaction across the border, in the name of a conquest that had become a pitched slaughter. Rarity could well believe it. So many things had been made believable in the final tally. Maybe Equestria should have had crueler rulers who could have promised to return the favor, a balance of destructions so that neither could ever occur. Or maybe that would have been a fool's game as well. They took a long, looping route around Ponyville, following the sweep of the long scar in the earth, blackness below them and darkness overhead as they strove for a distant strip of green overlooking the main route to Canterlot. It was a prolonged, hard trot before they made it there, to scramble thankfully up the green, cool slope and huddle amidst the thin tree line. Sweetie Belle motioned to a spot on the ground, and Rarity let her saddlebags fall there. Suddenly aware of how tired she'd become, she plodded her way to a patch of earth, sat down heavily, and looked to Sweetie Belle. The younger unicorn surveyed the land further east of the trees, with her eyes narrowed, looking for any sign of danger. "We'll chance a fire," said Sweetie Belle, after long deliberation. "There's no movement on the road ahead, as far as I can tell. No pony and nothing coming this way." Rarity relaxed. She'd venture to glance west as well, but only a cursory one. Who or what traveled into the darkness these days? Few enough were left to journey into the light, and those few, the monsters, the mad, the broken, lost, and wandering, those who'd barely survived under the shadow these long years, those who'd thrived in it and sought more prey, those without names. Tiredness rolled over her like a tide, and she settled down, and Sweetie Belle attended the fire, chattering lightly as she did so. She'd pushed herself far today. She deserved a rest. Both of them did. Warmth seeped into her weary bones, and sleep took her without warning or resistance. The last thing she saw before dreams of sunlit fields greeted her was the white circle of the moon, low in the sky, a distant silhouette stark against it. A sharp spur of mountain jutting up into the sky, a city hanging off one side. Canterlot. One more day should do it. The next rising came reluctantly for Sweetie Belle. Their fire had died early in the night, and she was cold on waking, colder than usual. She forced herself to struggle upright, kick her legs, and shake her head, coaxing the warmth of motion back throughout her body. Breath fluttered in and out of Rarity, whose blanket was once again curled up beneath her. Sweetie Belle sighed and spread it out over her again, before trotting to the ridge's edge. The grass there was thin, but better than nothing, and an early graze would be a welcome bit of ballast. She stepped to the edge, lowered her head to nip at a tuft, paused with her eyes wide, and smiled. Who said the east was dead yet? Along the trail trundled half-shadowed familiar shapes, creatures she'd seen coming from far and mysterious east before. Wandering pines, their trunks dark and pitted, their branches all but bare and their few leaves pale. Half a dozen of them made their way along the old road to Canterlot, great tangles of roots beneath them dragging them forwards with grasping tendrils. Poor, peaceful things. Her heart sang for them, and she hoped they'd finish their journey to where the sun never stopped shining. At least that wouldn't be a problem for them. A low note came almost involuntarily from her throat, rising in pitch and volume. She shifted it, modulated it to a sweet and nonsense stream of noise, expressing delighted welcome and little more. Sweetie Belle imagined that the trees responded, that their branches waved back to her. There was a shift in their line of travel to her approximate direction. A soft rumble came from the large dominant in their midst, as its roots briefly rustled against each of the others. It heaved itself up onto the slope with ponderous effort, and continued its stately wander, passing by Sweetie Belle. She stepped to one side, giving the cluster a generous berth as they lumbered by, rustling through the grass and crashing against smaller trees. A cough at Sweetie Belle's back broke her from her thoughts as she stared after them, and she turned to find Rarity, tottering upright and smiling blearily. "Good day, sweetie. I woke up when I heard the ruckus here. When was the last time these beauties came wandering by us?" "Couple years, maybe?" Sweetie Belle regarded the backs of the pines, mumbling at each other as they pressed onwards towards the sun. "It's amazing they're still around. They must have been surviving on moonlight and little else. Hope they make this last stretch okay." Rarity didn't respond, smiling vaguely at the retreating pines for a few moments before dipping her head to graze. Sweetie Belle looked to them for a minute longer, before turning back to the east and gauging the land. The moonlit landscape before the distant shape of Canterlot rolled like the sea, overgrown and fallow fields pockmarked with buildings gone to rack and ruin. Broad slashes of ash-black earth and glittering permafrost ran across it, shrapnel from the volley of spells that had descended onto the city itself. She could see the trail left by the wandering pines, but no other sign of movement. A gentle wind blew from the distant mountain and across the land, setting the fields to shivering, and Sweetie Belle sniffed. Nothing suspect, nothing but the faint scent of old vegetation, the mustiness of long cold ashes, and smoke, fresh and sharp. She frowned and sniffed again, turning her gaze from side to side to try and find the source. It was too new to just be their own fire. Where, though? "What's the matter?" said Rarity. "Smoke's in the air. There's a fire somewhere." Sweetie Belle's frown deepened as she focused on one of the buildings. Was that smoke in the air above it, or was she just seeing things? A scrap of mist? Frost from one of the nearby hills? Might have been made by some pony. Might be natural. Can't tell. "Ah, Advance with caution, then. Yeah. Sweetie Belle scrutinized the track ahead, and sighed when she failed to see anything. We'll keep off the main trail wherever we can, wherever it's gentle enough to let us keep a fair pace and not trip us up too much. Keep our eyes and ears open, and be ready to hide if we have to. We'll be safe if we make it to Canterlot. Last time we were there, I didn't see any pony else's hoofprints in the dust but ours from the time before that. No pony goes there anymore. Good for us, I suppose. Rarity turned back towards their camp. Race you there? Sweetie Belle grinned despite herself, and saw that everything was cleared away. Their belongings were packed, their fire's ashes were dispersed until there was no sign they'd been there, apart from a scorched impression on the earth. They set off once again, keeping the old winding road over the rolling hills in their sight, a surviving signpost at the side pointing the way towards Canterlot. The grassy hill under hoof rose to a peak, and then broke apart into hard, charred flakes of what might once have been stone. In the shallow between hills, they entered a village. The outlines of old buildings watched them like ghosts as they passed. A toppled and eviscerated water tower groaned as its breeze brushed over it. Its body melted and all but fused with the ground. Here and there, a fragment of bone, a half-skeleton slumped between two pillars, scorched lance heads in the dirt. They pressed on, the burnt body of the village silent in their wake, and found thin grass growing up under their hooves once again. Low tangles of bushes and prickly briars sprouted around them, dark and hard to spot under the moonlight. Rarity produced a little light from her horn to light the way, barely enough for her to see by, and hopefully faint enough to not be spotted if there were any watchers. Sweetie Belle caught a glimpse of the main road to their left, its surface slick with mud. She stared at it, her eyes still good enough to make out details in the moonlight. In its flurried surface, she saw hoofprints. Several, many, she couldn't judge the number, but they were recent, that was certain. Her breath caught in her throat, and Rarity said, "Is there trouble?" "Hoofprints on the main road," Sweetie Belle gestured at them. "I'm not sure how many. All I can tell is that they passed ahead of us recently. If we set a slow pace, we can stop early tonight and hope to miss them if they move even further ahead." "Maybe," said Rarity reluctantly. "We'll see how they run on. Perhaps they'll turn down a different route." "It's okay if we take it slowly. You'll get the chance to rest a bit more. Canterlot isn't going anywhere." No, I suppose not." Rarity's grim stare remained fixated on the city, though, until Sweetie Belle nudged her into motion. A low and broken stone wall blocked their path out of the overgrown field, and Sweetie Belle took a few minutes to clear a section of it to let Rarity through, working as quietly as one could with large lumps of stone. A few more minutes of walking through a thin strip of forest, and then they came across the next wound in the world. Before them, the land turned into a sea of dark and pitted rock, blistered across its surface with a sea of glistening crystals, white under the moon and starlight, a glittering sea reflecting the stars above. Sweetie Belle swallowed. She'd felt how the little crystals could tear open the base of a hoof, and leave a pony limping and trailing blood for days afterwards from wounds that refused to close. She'd seen what happened when a pony fell from the wounds to their hooves, screaming as their whole body writhed it with pain, tearing themselves to bloody scraps across the ground. She'd escaped and recuperated under Rarity's care, back in those early days after the spells had fallen, when she'd been too young and Rarity still had some strength in her. Her attacker hadn't been so lucky. "We'll go back to the main road," she said quietly. "I've cleared a trail there before, and we can pass through quickly and hop back to the east side when the land's normal again." She paused and looked at the breadth of the crystalline scar. A half-hour's careful work. "Or I could clear it here. No sense in taking risks." I'd take the main trail if it were only up to me, but I'll go with your best judgment, Sweetie. Sweetie Belle thought about it, and then turned to the side. Main trail it is, then. They cut a path towards the main road, the crystal river on one side, and the sparse forest on the other. Sweetie Belle was acutely conscious of Rarity's increasingly labored breaths behind her. The older unicorn was striving to meet the pace, but even when Sweetie slowed down, it was still a struggle. She'd end up running herself ragged, maybe open the wounds around her crystal-blistered side again. This would be the last time, Sweetie Belle told herself, no matter how much it hurt, no matter how much she had to stand firm, exact promises, watch Rarity's heart break. She wouldn't endure another. At least they could try to make this last one count. They'd bring home all the books they could haul, as many of those left unread as possible. That would keep Rarity satisfied for a time. A last hillock, all but solid with scratching undergrowth, that they climbed to overlook the main road. It swept before them in a cleft between shallow hills, little paths snaking off from it to smaller villages and isolated steadings. It ran into the crystal river, with one thin trail made dark and safe. Hoof marks clustered thick in the mud. They turned off to one side, leading down a path that led to a battered and abandoned farm building with some several hundred meters distant. Smoke crept from its chimneys. Light flickered past a broken window. Voices, one laughing, one whimpering, one squalling, and several others too faint to be discerned, could be heard inside it, even from afar. Sweetie Belle froze and crouched low, and Rarity stopped beside her, sinking with a pained grunt to her own haunches. For a long and heavy moment, the universe around Sweetie Belle and Rarity held its breath as they watched the distant farmhouse. Their eyes tracked its windows, watching for any watchers. Sweetie swore she could see an occasional shape glide past, a brief silhouette against whatever fire burned within. "Forge a new path, then," whispered Rarity. "Yes," muttered Sweetie. "Yes." They retraced their steps through the gloom as quietly as possible, trying not to freeze with alarm whenever a heavy patch of starlight or a beam of moonlight peeked past the gathering clouds. Once securely distant, it was nigh an hour's hard clearing with staff and magic before a safe path had been made. Sweetie Belle, her horn aching with prolonged effort, guided Rarity across, the older unicorn's light extinguished long ago. Once on the other side, they took a few moments to slump in the grass and breathe before Sweetie Belle caught the voices from the farmhouse on the breeze. They exchanged glances, rose to their aching hooves, and set out once again. It was still a long road to Canterlot, but they had no other choice but to keep walking it. Once upon a time, Equestria burned in the fires of war. Now it falls to two sisters to reclaim what they can. Written for the More Most Dangerous Game contest under the prompt of... what was the term? Reworking Fallout Equestria. Anyway, thanks for listening. I hope you enjoy, and I'll see you on the next half of the story. Have a good time, everyone. Goodbye.